Greetings, Varlets, and welcome to another one of my rants. My last rant brought me down a spiral of thoughts, all centered around the things people dislike about the Horus Heresy. Events they wish had turned out differently, plot points that interfere with the lore as it currently stood, or outright retconned it, questions they wish hadn't been answered, or been left to interpretation, or just bad character writing. And then it dawned on me. I've seen this before. A type of story that has all these problems. A type of story that is always polarizing to any fanbase. A prequel. And that's what the Horus Heresy is. It is the prequel to the story of the Imperium of Man. And Warhammer 40k has been around since 1987. But Horus Rising, which is the first book in the series, wasn't published until 2006. The lore of Warhammer 40k was already pretty well established by then, and the game was already in its 4th edition. Up to that point, lore pertaining to the heresy had been presented in the codices or hinted at in self-contained stories in the current setting, aka the 41st millennium. But in their infinite wisdom, Games Workshop decided to flesh out this mythical time in the Imperium's founding, to create a full narrative that details the events that led up to this point. So out came Horus Rising by Dan Abnett. And for a little added context, my introduction to the lore of Warhammer 40k, the video game Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels, came out back in 1995, almost a decade prior to its release. But GW weren't the first to do something like this. There's been a lot of storytellers who have gotten the same idea, from George Lucas with Star Wars, Ridley Scott with Aliens, and even Disney with its current slate of movies. We see plenty of examples of prequels. And with examples like those swirling around in my head, it brought one question to my mind. Are prequels inherently bad? I mean, they can't all be bad, can they? Well, I did a little soul searching and came up with at least 2 prequels that I considered to be good. First was R.A. Salvatore's Underdark trilogy, which is the recounting of the life of Drizzt Do'Urden prior to settling in the region known as the Icewind Dale. This series of books are a prequel to The Crystal Shard, the first book starring everyone's favorite not-so-dark elf. And my second example of what I consider to be a good prequel was Better Call Saul, which takes us back to a time before Saul Goodman, the infamous lawyer from Breaking Bad, took on Walter White as a client. It shows his rise from Jimmy McGill, a struggling attorney who was barely making ends meet, to the slick powerhouse we see in Breaking Bad. But are these the norm, or are they the exception? What exactly makes it difficult to create a backstory after the fact? What makes it difficult, if not inherently a bad idea, to make a prequel? I say that one of the things to keep in mind when making a prequel is if it was planned out. Was it always the writer's plan to tell the story in this manner? Let's take a look at one of the examples I gave earlier, Star Wars. No matter how much George Lucas doth protest to the contrary, I know for a fact he did not plan out his movies. Not the sequels, and most definitely not the prequels. You can easily tell just through the amount of retconning there is in each successive movie. Darth Vader being Anakin Skywalker, Leia and Luke being siblings, midichlorians, the Sith and their rule of 2. The list goes on. Each movie had to re-establish lore and exponentially suffered for it. And say what you will, but the Star Wars prequels are not good. You can like them, and there's nothing wrong with liking them, but they are not objectively good movies. And this is coming from a guy who loved The Phantom Menace. That Darth Maul fight was epic. Love me some Duel of the Fates. Used to listen to that song on repeat. Na-na, 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 oh. Yeah, I love that song. If you think about it, not a lot of writers go into a story intending to create a prequel further down the line. The closest thing I could find with this approach in mind is The Godfather Part 2, which weaves into the story Vito Corleone's rise to power in a flashback. You can clearly see that Vito's story is told in this manner to show the parallels with his son's struggles in being the head of the Corleone family. The author was trying to say something narratively and planned it accordingly, and you can clearly see that the Horus Heresy came with all kinds of retcons to the story of the Emperor and his sons, what with things like Fulcrum's personality overhaul from favorite son to absolute prick, and turning Alanis Pius from normal guardsman to perpetual. And speaking of retcons, another thing to keep in mind when making a prequel is how much does your audience already know about the backstory of your setting. I know a lot of creatives seem to hate this as of late, but the audience you've garnered over the years takes your story very seriously. You've already made them fall in love with the world you've built and the characters in it, so mess with their understanding of these at your own risk. A good tactic to avoid messing with the canon you've already established is touching on subjects or characters in your pre-existing story that your audience knows next to nothing about. Let's take Breaking Bad as an example. Aside from the interaction with Walter White, the audience knows nothing about Saul Goodman before the benighted chemistry teacher entered his office. This was fertile ground for a good story, and there was no pre-established obstacles in the writer's way. So, making a prequel about Saul Goodman was a good fit. Now, something like a Walter White prequel would have had a ton of landmines for the writers to get around. We already know a lot about him, so there's already a lot of canon set up for who Walter White is. Canon that the writer will now have to account for if he's trying to create this prequel. But like I mentioned earlier, the setting of Warhammer 40k was already well established by the time Horus Rising came out, so there was already plenty of lore on the subject of the Emperor, Horus, and many of the key events in the timeline. And due to the fact that the Horus Heresy was a group effort, with a lot of writers added to the story, it was bound to have many issues regarding the established canon at the time. And the last factor I'll touch on today is if the answer is better than the mystery. With the story the writer has created, there will always be some questions left unanswered, usually regarding some minor character in the story. And you think this means that they are the perfect vessels for a prequel, but you might be wrong. A lot of times the questions themselves can be what draws your audience in. It's these questions you've left unanswered that lead to fan theories and discussions, which can be very fun for your fan base to engage with. So as a writer, are you dooming your story to disappoint? As a storyteller, you need to ask yourself if the backstory you now have in mind is truly going to be better than whatever your audience has already imagined. If not, then maybe it's best to leave it alone. Good examples of stories with unanswered questions are Blade Runner and Total Recall. And if you haven't seen those movies, then don't worry, I won't be spoiling them for you. But both of these stories leave two major plot points unanswered, and their respective fan bases have been discussing these questions till this day. Now, let's take a look at the other good example I gave at the beginning of this rant, the Underdark trilogy, aka the prequel to the story of Drizzt Do'Urden. When we first meet Drizzt in the Crystal Shard, we have no idea why a Drow of all people would be this noble and warm-hearted individual, with not a bone of treachery in his body, which were not attributes associated with this fantasy race at the time. This led to a lot of questions of how could there exist a good Drow? Too many good questions without any answers. This made it logical to make a prequel about Drizzt. There was so much about him we didn't know. Too many contradictions to leave unexplained. Thus we got the Underdark trilogy, which in my opinion are probably the best books in the saga of Drizzt Do'Urden. But then we have a movie like Solo, a Star Wars story, which gives us the backstory of the infamous smuggler who shot first. No one really needed to know who he was prior to the now beloved trilogy, and the answers we got from Disney were incredibly disappointing.
Solo?
This movie was just the beginning of the ad for Disney Star Wars. And yeah, the Horus Heresy is chock full of answers that spoiled the mystery. Things like how the Emperor made the Primarchs, the characterization of many of the Primarchs themselves, the Perpetuals running around during the Heresy, who Alanis Pius was, yeah, really not letting go of that one, and countless other plot beats. So yeah, On top of needing to come up with a good story, the writer now needs to contend with these factors when deciding to write a prequel story. So are prequels inherently bad? No, as you've learned, there is ways to ensure your prequel is a good one, but they definitely had a steep hill to climb if they're going to be any good. But what do you Varlets think? What are your thoughts on prequels? Do you have any favorites? And what events depicted in the Horus Heresy books are even better than what you hoped for? I have been Interrogator Rosario, Attaché to Inquisitor Markham of the Order Hereticus, and I'm signing off from the grim dark future. Bye-bye, Varlets, and remember that not all data should be acquired. If you like what you heard, then please feel free to drop it in the comments or hit me up on Instagram at Rosario Divas Art, or you can watch my live streams over on Twitch, which is also at Rosario Divas Art.